They say money talks, but in New York City, wealth screams. We've all seen them. The people who think their bank account gives them the right to treat service workers like dirt. But what happens when the person you're stepping on is the only one holding the dynamite? In 2024, at the city's most exclusive restaurant, a billionaire named Richard Coleman made the mistake of humiliating a quiet new waitress named Sophie Bennett. He thought she was nobody. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. What follows is the true-to-life account of how one invisible girl turned a gala dinner into a crime scene, exposing a 20-year-old secret that brought an empire crashing down. You are not going to believe the twist at the end. The Obsidian Club didn't just serve dinner, it served power. Located on the 45th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, it was the kind of place where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people's mortgage payments. The walls were lined with dark mahogany, the lighting was always dim, and the air smelled of truffle oil and expensive cologne. For Sophie Bennett, it was hell. Sophie was 24, with tired eyes and hands that were already rough from years of scrubbing dishes and carrying heavy trays. She had only been working at the Obsidian for 3 weeks. She was the new girl, which in the hospitality industry meant she was the scapegoat for everything that went wrong. "Table 4 needs water, Bennett. Move your feet," snapped Henri, the floor manager. Henri was a short man with a pristine tuxedo and a soul made of sandpaper. He hated new hires. He claimed they lowered the aesthetic. "Yes, Henri, right away," Sophie murmured, grabbing a crystal pitcher. She moved through the dining room like a ghost. That was the first rule of high-end service. Be invisible. You fill the glass before the guest realizes it's empty. You clear the plate the second the fork is put down. You exist only to serve, never to be seen. But tonight, invisibility was going to be impossible. The reservation list for the evening had a name highlighted in red at the very top: Richard Coleman. Everyone knew Richard Coleman. He was a real estate tycoon, a man who had reshaped the skyline of the city. He was worth billions. He was also known in the service industry as the Butcher, not because he was violent, but because he would butcher your self-esteem for sport. He tipped poorly, complained loudly, and had gotten at least 3 waiters fired in the last year alone for looking at him wrong. "Listen to me," Henri hissed, pulling the staff into the kitchen for the pre-shift lineup. "Mr. Coleman is hosting a preliminary dinner tonight, ahead of the charity gala on Saturday. He will be with his business partners. If any of you, and I mean any of you, embarrass this establishment, you won't just be fired. I will ensure you never work in this city again." Henry's eyes lingered on Sophie. "Bennett, you are on water and bread duty only for his table. Do not speak to him. Do not look him in the eye. Do not breathe too loudly. Do you understand?" "Understood," Sophie said, gripping her apron tight. When Richard Coleman arrived, the atmosphere in the room shifted. He was a large man in his 60s, wearing a suit that cost $50,000. He walked with a limp, an old skiing injury, the tabloid said, and had a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He was accompanied by 2 younger men in sharp suits and a woman named Isabel, who looked terrified to be there. They took the center table, the best table. Sophie watched from the shadows near the service station. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but not for the reason Henri thought. She wasn't nervous about spilling water. She was nervous because she recognized Richard Coleman. She knew things about him that even the FBI didn't know. "Water," Coleman barked, snapping his fingers in the air without looking up from his menu. Sophie froze. Snapping fingers was the universal sign of disrespect. "Go," Henry whispered aggressively into her ear, shoving her forward. Sophie approached the table. She took a deep breath, composed her face into a mask of neutrality, and began to pour sparkling water into Coleman's glass. "No ice," Coleman said sharply. Sophie paused. The glass already had ice in it. The busboy had preset it. "I apologize, sir. Let me get you a fresh glass." Coleman looked up. It was the first time he actually saw her. His eyes were cold, blue, and dead. He scanned her face, looking for weakness. "Don't bother," he sneered, grabbing the glass. He dumped the water, ice and all, right onto the pristine white tablecloth. The cold liquid splashed onto the expensive carpet. The restaurant went silent. "Now," Coleman smiled, a cruel, shark-like grin. "Clean it up, and bring me a fresh one, without ice. Can your little brain handle that?" Sophie stood there, water dripping from the edge of the table onto her shoe. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. The other diners looked away, pretending not to see, sipping their wine. They ignored her. To them, she was just a clumsy servant. "Of course, sir," Sophie said, her voice steady. "Right away." She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She grabbed a napkin and knelt on the floor to dab at the carpet, right at Richard Coleman's feet. As she wiped the water, Coleman leaned down, pretending to adjust his napkin. He kicked her hand. It was subtle, barely a nudge, but it was intentional. "Pathetic," he muttered, low enough that only she could hear. Sophie looked up at him from the floor. For a split second, the mask slipped. She didn't look like a scared waitress. She looked like a hunter sighting prey. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Richard," she thought. Saturday is coming. The next 3 days were a masterclass in abuse. Richard Coleman came in every night leading up to the Saturday gala. It was as if he had chosen Sophie as his personal entertainment. On Thursday, he sent back a steak 3 times, claiming it was tough, even though it was A5 Wagyu beef that melted like butter. On the 3rd time, he threw the napkin into Sophie's face. "Take it away," he spat, "and tell the chef he's incompetent." On Friday, he accused Sophie of stealing his credit card. The restaurant went into lockdown. Henri, the manager, forced Sophie to empty her pockets and her locker in front of the entire staff. "I didn't take it," Sophie said, her voice shaking with feigned fear. "Please check the cameras." They checked the security footage. It turned out Coleman had accidentally dropped the card under the table. When the busboy found it and returned it, Coleman didn't apologize. He just laughed. "Well," Coleman said, looking at Sophie with amusement, "you have the face of a thief. You can't blame me for being cautious." Henri apologized profusely to Coleman and gave him a complimentary bottle of Dom Perignon. He didn't apologize to Sophie. Instead, he pulled her into the back alley by the dumpsters. "You are bad luck," Henri smoked a cigarette furiously. "Mr. Coleman is the biggest donor for the gala tomorrow night. The mayor will be there. The police commissioner will be there. If you upset him tomorrow, Sophie, I will destroy you." Sophie looked at the brick wall, watching a rat scurry behind a bin. "Maybe I shouldn't work the gala, Henri, if I'm such a problem." "No," Henri snapped. "We are short-staffed. Jessica called in sick. You will work. But you will be a ghost. You will clear plates and refill wine, and you will stay out of his line of sight. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Henri." Sophie walked home that night in the rain. She lived in a tiny, cramped studio apartment in Queens, an hour and a half away by subway. When she got inside, she didn't turn on the TV. She didn't call a friend. She walked to her closet and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside wasn't shoes, it was a stack of documents, a flash drive, and a faded photograph of a man in a suit holding a little girl. The man looked happy. The man looked proud. The man in the photo was David Bennett, Sophie's father. 20 years ago, David Bennett had been Richard Coleman's business partner. They had built the Coleman empire together. Then, one day, millions of dollars went missing from the pension fund. Coleman blamed David. He planted evidence. He testified against him. David Bennett went to prison for 12 years. He died of a heart attack in his cell 2 weeks before his release. Coleman kept the money, kept the company, and erased David from history. Sophie touched the photo. "He thinks you were a thief, Dad," she whispered. "Tomorrow, everyone finds out who the real thief is." She wasn't just a waitress. Sophie Bennett had spent the last 4 years studying forensic accounting online. She had spent the last 6 months infiltrating the hospitality circles Coleman frequented. She had taken the abuse. She had let him humiliate her. She had let him kick her hand and throw napkins in her face. Because every time he got arrogant, he got careless. And on Friday night, while Coleman was laughing about the stolen credit card, he had left his phone unlocked on the table for exactly 45 seconds while he berated Henri. Sophie had been refilling the water. She had a small device in her apron pocket, a high-range cloner she'd bought on the dark web. It didn't steal data, it just needed to be within 6 inches of a target device to mirror the Bluetooth signature. While he was screaming at Henri, she had leaned in to pour. Ping, ah! She had his access codes. Sophie sat on her floor, opened her battered laptop, and synced the data. Files began to scroll across her screen. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, bribes to city zoning officials, and most damning of all, a digital ledger from 20 years ago labeled Project Horizon. It was the proof that her father was innocent. But having the proof wasn't enough. Richard Coleman owned the judges. He owned the press. If she went to the police, the evidence would disappear, and Sophie might disappear along with it. She needed to do something he couldn't bribe his way out of. She needed to do it live, in front of the cameras, in front of the elite. The gala was tomorrow. It was a black tie event to raise money for underprivileged youth. The irony made Sophie want to vomit. She packed her uniform. She polished her black shoes. She checked the tiny wireless lapel microphone she had sewn into the lining of her serving vest. Everyone ignored the waitress, she said to the empty room. She closed the laptop. Let's see if they can ignore me tomorrow. The Obsidian Club had been transformed. If it looked expensive on a normal Tuesday, on Saturday night it looked like the inside of a jewelry box. White orchids, thousands of them, cascaded from the ceiling. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music barely audible over the dull roar of the city's wealthiest citizens greeting one another. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, roasted duck, and money. Sophie stood by the service station, adjusting her bow tie. Her hands were trembling, but she clasped them behind her back so no one would notice. "Check your stations," Henri hissed, sweating profusely. He looked like a man on the verge of a cardiac event. "Mayor Donovan is in the elevator. The police commissioner is already at the bar. If I see a single empty glass, you are fired. If I see a crumb on a tablecloth, you are fired. Go!" The team scattered like ants. Sophie grabbed a tray of champagne flutes. As she weaved through the crowd, she felt invisible in the truest sense of the word. These people didn't see a human being. They saw a floating tray of alcohol. A woman in a red silk dress bumped into Sophie, spilling a drop of champagne on her own wrist. "Watch it!" the woman snapped, wiping her wrist with disgust. "Apologies, ma'am." Sophie lowered her head. "Hire better help," the woman muttered to her husband as she walked away. Sophie's eyes scanned the room. She wasn't looking for dirty glasses. She was mapping the room. North corner, emergency exit, blocked by a security guard named Thomas. He's distracted, checking his phone every 2 minutes. East Wall, the audio-visual booth, that was the target. The AV booth was a small, glass-walled enclosure raised slightly above the dining floor. Inside, a technician was queuing up the slideshow for the night's speeches. That computer controlled the massive LED screen behind the main stage. Sophie touched the hidden pocket in her apron. The flash drive was there. It was small, silver, and looked exactly like the one the technician was using. She had seen it during setup earlier that afternoon. Then, the room went quiet. Richard Coleman had arrived. He didn't just walk in, he made an entrance. He was flanked by his entourage, wearing a tuxedo with a diamond lapel pin. He looked like a king arriving to inspect his subjects. He shook hands with the mayor, clapped the police commissioner on the shoulder, and laughed loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Sophie watched him from the shadows. She remembered her father, David, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, weeping because he couldn't afford a lawyer to fight Coleman's lies. She remembered the day the police dragged him out of their house while the neighbors watched. "You destroyed my family to build this," she thought. "Tonight, I tear it down." "Bennett," Henry snapped his fingers. "Mr. Coleman's table, champagne. Now." Sophie stiffened. This was it. She walked toward the head table. Coleman was seated with his wife, Isabel, and 2 business partners. He was in high spirits, his face flushed with wine. "Richard," one of the partners said, raising a glass, "to the new stadium deal. The city council is practically eating out of your hand." Coleman laughed, a deep, gravelly sound. "Everyone has a price, Bob. Even the city council. You just have to know what currency they prefer." Sophie stepped in, placing a fresh glass of champagne near Coleman's hand. She moved with practiced grace, trying to be essentially non-existent. But Coleman was in a mood to toy with someone. He caught her wrist as she pulled away. The grip was tight, painful. "Well, well," Coleman sneered, looking up at her. "The clumsy girl. Henri let you work tonight. He's braver than I thought." The table went silent. Isabel looked down at her plate, embarrassed. "I'm doing my best, sir," Sophie said, her voice quiet. "Your best?" Coleman scoffed. He looked at his partners. "You see this? This is the problem with the younger generation. They do the bare minimum and expect a medal. You're lucky I don't have you thrown out right now." He released her wrist with a shove. "Get out of my sight," he said. "You're ruining my appetite." Sophie stumbled back a step, catching her balance. "Yes, sir." She retreated to the kitchen, her heart pounding. But as she pushed through the swinging doors, a grim smile touched her lips. He had touched her wrist. In the confusion of his grip, while everyone was looking at his face, Sophie had managed to slide his personal cell phone off the table and onto her tray, hidden beneath a napkin. It was a risky move, insanely risky. But Coleman was drunk on power and wine. He hadn't noticed the weight difference. Inside the kitchen, the noise was deafening. Chefs were shouting, pans were clanging. Sophie ducked into the dry storage pantry. She pulled out Coleman's phone. It was unlocked, just as she hoped. The cloning she did days ago gave her access, but having the physical device allowed her to bypass the 2-factor authentication for his private cloud server. She connected the phone to her own burner device. Download complete. She had the emails, the ones from yesterday, the ones discussing the bribes for the stadium deal he had just bragged about. Now, she had to return the phone before he noticed it was gone. Sophie grabbed a fresh bottle of sparkling water. She walked back out onto the floor. Coleman was busy laughing at a joke. She approached the table, poured water for Isabel, and deftly slid the phone back onto the tablecloth next to his bread plate. He never even looked at her. Step 1 complete, she whispered to herself. Now for step 2. The AV booth. The gala was moving into its second phase. The speeches. The lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. A local news anchor, serving as the MC, walked up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight is about giving back. Tonight is about the future. Applause rippled through the room. While the attention was fixed on the stage, Sophie made her move. She wasn't serving anymore. She had slipped off her apron and tossed it in a laundry bin. Underneath, she wore a simple black blouse and slacks, generic enough to look like technical crew if you didn't look too closely. She moved along the shadowed wall toward the AV booth. The booth was guarded by a single rope, but the technician inside was busy queuing up the intro video. He was wearing headphones, bobbing his head to music only he could hear. Sophie needed him out of there. She pulled a small vial from her pocket. It contained a mix of vinegar and baking soda, crude but effective. She knelt by the ventilation intake at the base of the booth and poured the mixture onto a rag, shoving it into the vent. Within seconds, a foul, acrid smell began to circulate inside the glass booth. The technician wrinkled his nose. He took off his headphones. He looked around, sniffing. The smell was awful, like rotting eggs. He stood up, looking confused. He opened the glass door and stepped out, waving his hand in front of his face. "What is that?" he muttered to the security guard, Thomas. "Smells like a sewer backup," Thomas grunted. "I need to check the intake fan. Keep an eye on the board," the tech said, walking away toward the back hallway. This was her window. Thomas, the guard, was bored. He was watching the pretty news anchor on stage. He didn't notice the shadow slipping behind the booth's open door. Sophie was inside. She crouched low, below the glass line. The computer hummed in front of her. The screen showed a playlist. Intro.mp4, Mayor Speech.ppt, Coleman Tribute.move. Her hands flew across the keyboard. She didn't delete anything. That would cause a panic. Instead, she inserted her flash drive into the USB port. A new file appeared, Truth.mp4. She renamed the file Coleman Tribute.move and swapped it with the original file, deleting the real tribute. It took 10 seconds. "Hey!" Sophie froze. It wasn't Thomas. It was Henri. The manager was standing 10 feet away, staring right at the glass booth. He squinted. "Who is in there?" Sophie dropped to the floor, pressing herself into the carpet. "Thomas," Henri whispered loudly. "Why is the booth empty?" "Gary went to check the vent. Smelled like sulfur," Thomas replied. Henri marched over. He poked his head into the booth. Sophie held her breath. She was curled into a ball under the desk, her knees pressed against her chest. If he looked down, it was over. She could see his polished shoes inches from her face. "Useless incompetence," Henri muttered. He looked at the screen. The playlist was running. "At least the playlist is queued." He tapped the desk, right above Sophie's head, and walked away. "Find Gary. Tell him Coleman speaks in 5 minutes. If he's not back, I'm firing him." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, walking off to find the tech. The booth was empty. The door was open. Sophie crawled out, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She slipped back into the shadows just as the lights dipped further for the main event. "And now," the MC announced, her voice booming over the speakers, "please welcome the man of the hour, the visionary who made this all possible, Mr. Richard Coleman." The room erupted. People stood up, a thunderous ovation. Richard Coleman stood up, buttoning his jacket. He soaked in the adoration. He waved to the mayor. He kissed his wife on the cheek. He walked up the stairs to the stage, favoring his bad leg, looking every inch the benevolent billionaire. Sophie stood at the very back of the room, near the kitchen doors. She had put her apron back on. She was just a waitress again. Coleman took the podium. He adjusted the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you all. When I look out at this room, I see success. But I also see responsibility. 20 years ago, I started this company with a dream of a better city." Sophie gripped the edge of a serving table. "Here it comes." "I did not build this alone," Coleman continued. "I built it on a foundation of trust, and tonight I want to share a video that highlights exactly where we came from." He gestured to the massive screen behind him. "Watch this," Coleman smiled. The lights went completely black. The huge LED screen flickered to life. The audience waited for inspirational music. They waited for shots of skyscrapers and happy children. Instead, the screen was black with white text. Date: October 14th, 2004. Audio recording, Office of Richard Coleman. The room went deadly silent. Then a voice crackled through the high-quality speakers. It wasn't a narrator, it was Richard Coleman. But he sounded younger, and he sounded angry. "I don't care about the pension fund, David. Take the money. Move it to the Cayman account." A second voice answered. Shaky, terrified. It was David Bennett, Sophie's father. "I can't do that, Richard. That's the employee's retirement. It's illegal. It's theft." Coleman's voice boomed through the ballroom again. "Then we make it look like theft. Your theft. I have the judges in my pocket, David. If you don't sign these papers, you're going to prison. And your little girl, what's her name? Sophie? She's going to grow up on the street." On stage, Richard Coleman froze. The smile vanished. He turned around, staring at the screen in horror. "Cut it," he screamed. "Cut the feed." But there was no one in the booth. Gary the tech was still looking for a non-existent ventilation problem. The video continued. Photos appeared, bank statements, signatures, emails from yesterday mocking the mayor. Email to B. Hawkins, from R. Coleman. Subject: The Idiot Mayor. Mayor Donovan is a cheap buy, a donation to his re-election campaign, and he'll rezone the park. He doesn't care about the kids. He just wants the photo op. A collective gasp swept through the room. Mayor Donovan, sitting in the front row, turned a shade of purple that matched the wine. He stood up, knocking his chair over. Coleman was panicking now. He was slamming his hand on the podium. "Technical difficulties. Turn it off. This is a deep fake. This is AI." Then the screen changed one last time. It showed a live video feed. The camera was grainy. It was coming from inside the room. The angle was low, looking up from a service station. It showed Richard Coleman, just 30 minutes ago, grabbing Sophie's wrist. The audio was crystal clear. "You see this? This is the problem with the younger generation. You're lucky I don't have you thrown out right now." Then the camera panned. It turned around to show the face of the person holding the camera. It was Sophie. She looked directly into the lens, her face projected 30 feet high behind the man who destroyed her life. On the screen, giant Sophie spoke. "My name is Sophie Bennett. David Bennett was my father. He didn't steal your money. Richard Coleman did. And I have the receipts." The screen went black. The lights in the ballroom slammed back on. Every single head turned toward the back of the room, toward the kitchen doors, toward Sophie. Richard Coleman stood on stage, stripped of his dignity, stripped of his lies. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Security!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Arrest that girl! She's a terrorist! Seize her!" Henry, the manager, looked at Sophie. He looked at the furious mayor. He looked at the ruined billionaire. Sophie didn't run. She didn't hide. She reached into her apron, pulled out her name tag, and dropped it on the floor. "Check, please," she said loudly. And then chaos erupted. The ballroom of the Obsidian Club was no longer a place of elegance. It was a riot. The moment Sophie dropped her name tag, the illusion of order shattered. Mayor Donovan was shouting at his aides to get the cameras away from him. Isabel Coleman was weeping, her face buried in her hands, and Richard Coleman, red-faced and looking like a cornered animal, was pointing at the kitchen doors. "Thomas, grab her! Don't let her leave the building!" Coleman screamed, his voice shredding with desperation. Thomas, the large security guard, snapped out of his shock. He barreled toward the kitchen doors, knocking over a tray of unfinished creme brulees. Sophie didn't wait. She turned on her heel and sprinted through the swinging double doors into the kitchen. "Move!" she yelled. The kitchen staff froze. They had heard the commotion, but they didn't know the specifics. They only saw the quiet girl, Sophie, running for her life, followed by a 200-pound security guard. Henry, the manager, was standing by the pass, holding a clipboard. He saw Sophie coming. He saw Thomas behind her. His instinct was to follow orders. He stepped into Sophie's path, spreading his arms. "You aren't going anywhere, Bennett," Henry snarled. "You ruined my night." Sophie didn't have time to stop. She didn't have time to argue. She was smaller than him, but she had momentum. She lowered her shoulder, preparing to crash into him. But she didn't have to. A heavy metal ladle slammed onto the stainless steel counter with the force of a gunshot. "Get out of the way, Henry!" It was Marco, the executive sous chef, the man who had been forced to recook a perfect steak 3 times because of Coleman's ego. Marco hated Coleman, and he had been listening to the audio feed from the dining room speakers. Marco stepped forward, his large frame blocking Henri. He shoved the manager aside effortlessly. "Run, kid," Marco said to Sophie, not even looking at her. He kicked a rolling cart of dirty dishes into the path of the doorway, just as Thomas burst through. Crash. Plates shattered. Silverware flew everywhere. Thomas tripped over the cart, going down in a heap of broken porcelain and old sauce. "Thanks, Marco," Sophie gasped. She didn't look back. She sprinted past the dish pit, past the walk-in freezers, and toward the rear exit. She knew the building better than Coleman did. Coleman took the private elevator. Sophie took the service routes. She knew that the freight elevator on this floor was slow. Too slow. If she waited for it, Thomas would catch her. She hit the stairwell door, bursting into the concrete landing, 45 floors down. She couldn't run down 45 flights. Her legs would give out, or security from the lobby would intercept her by the time she reached the 10th floor. She needed to disappear before she hit the ground. She ran down 2 flights of stairs to the 43rd floor, the mechanical level. It was a floor filled with HVAC units, water heaters and laundry chutes. Sophie yanked the heavy fire door open. The air here was hot and loud. She ran to the laundry chute. It was a steel hatch designed for dropping bags of dirty tablecloths down to the basement laundry facility. It was tight, it was dangerous, but it was the only way past the lobby. She could hear footsteps pounding on the stairs above her. Thomas was coming. "She's in the stairwell," Thomas shouted into his radio. "Lock down the lobby elevators. Seal the exits." Sophie grabbed a canvas laundry bag from a pile nearby. She stepped into it, pulling it up to her waist to protect her legs from friction burns. She opened the hatch. The darkness below seemed to go on forever. "Please don't die," she whispered. She jumped. The slide was terrifying. It was a spiral chute designed to slow the descent of heavy linens, but Sophie picked up speed. She tumbled, hitting the sides, the canvas bag shielding her skin from the metal. She spun around and around, dizzy and disoriented, sliding through the guts of the skyscraper. It felt like minutes, but it was only seconds. Whoomp. She landed in a massive pile of soft, dirty towels in the basement laundry room. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, staring at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, gasping for air. She was alive. She scrambled out of the bin. The basement was quiet. The laundry staff had gone home for the night. She stripped off the canvas bag. Her uniform was torn, her hair was a mess, and she smelled like bleach and stale wine. She looked like a wreck, but she was free. She bypassed the main loading dock, knowing there were cameras there. Instead, she went to the old coal chute door, a small, rusted exit that led into the alleyway behind the neighboring deli. She pushed the door open. The cold New York night air hit her face. It felt like victory. Sirens were wailing in the distance. Blue and red lights reflected off the glass of the skyscraper above her. The police were arriving. Sophie pulled her hood up. She merged into the crowd of pedestrians on 6th Avenue, just another face in the city. She reached into her pocket. She still had her phone. She had one more message to send. She opened a secure app and typed 3 words to a contact labeled "The Editor." It's done. Publish. The next 48 hours were a bloodbath. It wasn't a physical war, it was a digital one, and Richard Coleman was losing on every front. Sophie's escape was just the beginning. While she was sliding down a laundry chute, the dead man's switch she had set up on her laptop in Queens activated. At exactly 9 p.m., while Coleman was still screaming at his security team in the ballroom, 3 emails arrived in the inboxes of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the United States Department of Justice. The subject line was, "Evidence, the Coleman-Bennett Conspiracy, 2004-2024. The files were exhaustive. They contained the original pension fund ledgers, the forged signatures that framed David Bennett, the audio recordings of Coleman bribing judges, and, the cherry on top, a video of Coleman laughing about firing a pregnant housekeeper because she walked too slow. By Sunday morning, the story was global. The waitress was the #1 trending topic on Twitter X. Coleman Exposed was #2, the video of Sophie standing on the screen, her face towering over Coleman while he panicked, had been viewed 400 million times. Richard Coleman tried to fight back. He hired the most expensive PR crisis team in the country. On Sunday afternoon, he held a press conference from the steps of his mansion in the Hamptons. He looked terrible. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a cashmere sweater, meant to make him look approachable. His wife, Isabel, was notably absent. "This is a deep fake attack," Coleman lied, looking directly into the cameras. "The woman known as Sophie Bennett is a cyber-terrorist. The audio you heard was AI-generated. The documents are forgeries. I am the victim here." It might have worked 10 years ago, but not today. While Coleman was speaking, the FBI was raiding the offices of his accounting firm. While Coleman was denying the audio, the mayor, Mayor Donovan, who had been humiliated in the video, decided to save his own skin. Donovan called a simultaneous press conference at City Hall. "I was manipulated," the mayor claimed, sweating under the lights. "Richard Coleman pressured me. I am fully cooperating with the district attorney. I am handing over all emails and correspondence. I am a victim of his corruption, just like the rest of you." The mayor threw Coleman under the bus to avoid jail time. It was the final nail in the coffin. By Monday morning, the stock price of Coleman Enterprises had plummeted by 78%. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Richard Coleman as CEO. He was fired from the company he built on the bones of Sophie's father. But Coleman wasn't done. He was a narcissist. He couldn't accept defeat. Monday night, 11:12 p.m. Sophie was sitting in a cheap motel room in New Jersey. She hadn't gone back to her apartment. It was swarming with reporters. She was watching the news on a small, fuzzy TV. The news anchor broke in with a special report. Breaking news. Federal authorities have issued an arrest warrant for Richard Coleman on charges of fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, and conspiracy. However, agents arriving at his Hamptons estate found the house empty. Sophie sat up. He's running. She grabbed her laptop. She still had the clone of his phone. She opened the geolocation tracker. It was active. Coleman was arrogant. He had ditched his main phone, but he had kept his burner, the one Sophie had cloned, thinking it was safe. He thought no one knew about it. The dot on the map was moving fast. It was on the Van Wyck Expressway. He was heading to JFK Airport. Sophie dialed the tip line number flashing on the TV screen. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," a voice answered. "My name is Sophie Bennett," she said clearly. "Richard Coleman is in a black SUV, license plate 4 Victor Kilo 9. He is heading to the private airfield at JFK. He's trying to get to his jet." "Hold on, Miss Bennett. Can you verify—" "Just catch him," Sophie said. "Do it for my dad." She hung up. 30 minutes later, the news feed cut to a live helicopter shot over JFK Airport. A black SUV was racing across the tarmac, weaving between parked airplanes. Behind it, 6 police cruisers and 2 black FBI SUVs were in pursuit, lights flashing in the darkness. The SUV screeched to a halt near a sleek Gulfstream jet. The engines of the jet were already spooling up. The driver's door opened. Richard Coleman fell out. He was carrying a duffel bag. He looked wild, his hair blowing in the jet wash. He started running toward the stairs of the plane. "Stop! Federal agents!" Coleman didn't stop. He scrambled up the stairs. But the pilot, seeing the army of police cars surrounding the plane, made a choice. He didn't want to go to prison for aiding a fugitive. The engines powered down. The stairs began to retract, but not to let Coleman in, to shut him out. Coleman banged on the door of his own jet. "Open it! I pay you! Open the door!" He turned around. He was surrounded. 50 agents, weapons drawn. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face. He looked small. He looked old. He dropped the duffel bag. He fell to his knees on the tarmac. The camera zoomed in as an agent cuffed his hands behind his back. In the motel room, Sophie watched the man who had called her pathetic being dragged away like a common criminal. She didn't cheer. She didn't laugh. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo of her father. She placed it against the TV screen, right over Coleman's defeated face. "You're clear, Dad," she whispered. "We won." But the story wasn't quite over. Because when you topple a giant, the world wants to meet the giant slayer. For 3 weeks after the arrest of Richard Coleman, Sophie Bennett didn't step foot outside. The world outside her motel window had turned into a circus. Every major news network was camped out in front of her old apartment in Queens. Her phone, which she had finally turned back on, had crashed twice from the sheer volume of notifications. Everyone wanted a piece of the waitress who took down a billionaire. Hollywood producers were calling. Literary agents were emailing. People who hadn't spoken to her since high school were suddenly sliding into her DMs, claiming they always knew she was special. Sophie ignored them all. She sat in the motel room, wearing sweatpants, drinking cheap coffee, and watching the legal system finally do its job. The fall of the House of Coleman was absolute. It was a domino effect of catastrophic proportions. Once the FBI had Coleman in custody, the people he had paid off for decades started scrambling for immunity deals. The city council members who had taken bribes to approve his zoning permits turned on him. The contractors who had helped him embezzle funds testified against him. Even his wife, Isabel, filed for divorce and provided the prosecution with a hidden safe deposit box key that contained the final, undeniable proof of his racketeering. But for Sophie, the victory wasn't watching Coleman on the news in an orange jumpsuit. It was the letter she received on a rainy Tuesday morning. It was delivered by a courier in a dark suit. The return address was the Department of Justice. Sophie opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single, heavy sheet of paper with an embossed gold seal. Official exoneration regarding the matter of The People versus David Bennett, 2004. After a review of new evidence, the conviction of David Bennett is hereby vacated. The state formally apologizes for the miscarriage of justice. Sophie read the words 3 times. She traced her finger over her father's name. "It's gone, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "The stain is gone." She didn't cry. She had cried enough tears over the last 20 years to fill an ocean. This wasn't a moment for sadness. It was a moment for action. The next day, Sophie finally put on real clothes, a simple navy blazer and jeans, and took a taxi to Manhattan. She wasn't going to a TV interview. She was going to the office of James Holloway, the attorney managing the class action lawsuit against Coleman Enterprises. The office was in a glass tower that looked suspiciously like the ones Coleman used to build. Holloway was a sharp man with grey hair and kind eyes. When Sophie walked in, the entire office staff stood up. They didn't clap, but they nodded. It was a silent show of respect. "Miss Bennett," Holloway said, shaking her hand firmly. "Please sit down." He slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "We have finalized the seizure of Coleman's personal assets," Holloway explained. "Because your father was the primary scapegoat for the embezzlement scheme, and because his wrongful imprisonment led directly to his death, the court has awarded the Bennett estate a significant portion of the recovered funds." Sophie looked at the folder. "How significant?" Holloway opened the file and pointed to a number at the bottom of the page. Sophie stopped breathing for a second. It was a number with 7 zeros. $45,000. $45 million. It was an incomprehensible amount of money. It was enough to buy the Obsidian Club 10 times over. It was enough to never work a day in her life again. It was enough to buy an island. "This is," Sophie stammered, "this is blood money." "It's justice money," Holloway corrected her gently. "It's the money Coleman stole from your father's reputation and his life. It belongs to you, Sophie. It's over. You won." Sophie stared at the check. She thought about the nights she had eaten instant noodles because she couldn't afford vegetables. She thought about the shoes with holes in the soles she had worn for 2 winters. "I don't want to be like him," Sophie said quietly. "You won't be," Holloway smiled, "because you're asking that question." Sophie took the check, but she had one stop to make before she went to the bank. She needed to go back to the Obsidian Club. The restaurant was closed. The windows were papered over. A sign on the door read, "Under new management." "Coming soon." Sophie tried the side door, the one leading to the kitchen. It was unlocked. She walked into the dark, silent kitchen. It smelled of stale grease and dust. The stoves were cold. The noise and chaos of that night seemed like a distant nightmare. "We're closed, miss." Sophie turned around. Sitting on a crate near the walk-in fridge was Marco, the sous chef. He was smoking a cigarette, looking tired. "Marco," Sophie said. Marco's eyes widened. He stood up, dropping his cigarette. "Sophie. Jesus, kid. I saw you on the news. You're practically royalty now." "Not royalty," Sophie said, walking over. "Just settled." "What are you doing here?" Marco asked. "You should be on a beach in Italy." "I wanted to see it," she said, looking around the empty kitchen. "I wanted to make sure the monster was really dead." Marco chuckled darkly. "He's dead all right. The IRS stripped the place. Henry was the first to go, by the way. The owners fired him 5 minutes after you ran out that door. Blamed him for the security breach. I heard he's working at a drive-thru in Jersey now." Sophie felt a twinge of satisfaction. And you? Me. Marco shrugged. I'm packing up my knives. New owners want a celebrity chef. I'm too old and too grumpy for that. I'll find a diner somewhere. Cook some eggs. Keep it simple. Sophie looked at Marco. She remembered the moment in the hallway when Henry tried to tackle her and Marco had stepped in. He had risked his job to help her. He was the only one who had shown her kindness in this shark tank. Do you have a dream, Marco? Sophie asked suddenly. Marco blinked. What? If you didn't have to cook eggs in a diner, Sophie said, stepping closer. If you could open your own place, what would it be? Marco sighed, looking at the ceiling. I always wanted to do authentic Tuscan. Small place, just 20 tables. Fresh pasta, good wine, no snobs, no obsidian nonsense. Just food for people who like to eat. But, he laughed, that takes capital and credit, neither of which I have. Sophie reached into her purse. She pulled out the folder Holloway had given her. She didn't give him the check, of course, but she pulled out a business card she had picked up from Holloway's desk. I'm looking for an investment, Sophie said, her voice steady. I have a significant amount of capital coming in, and I need a partner who knows how to run a kitchen without treating people like garbage. Marco stared at her. Sophie, are you serious? I'm not going to keep all the money, Marco, she said. I don't need $45 million. I need enough to live. The rest, I want to build things. Good things. I want to open a restaurant where the staff is paid double the minimum wage, where no one gets screamed at, where the food is real. She handed him the card. Call this lawyer tomorrow. Tell him you're my partner. Marco looked at the card, then back at Sophie. His eyes were wet. He wiped his hand on his apron and extended it. It would be an honor, boss, he said. Sophie shook his head. Not boss. Partners. 6 months later. The wind was blowing through the autumn trees at the Cypress Hill Cemetery. It was a beautiful day, crisp and clear. Sophie knelt in front of a simple grey headstone. It had been cleaned recently. Fresh flowers, white lilies, sat in a vase at the base. David Bennett, 1970, 2016, beloved father, an innocent man. Sophie touched the cold stone. She looked different now. Her hair was cut in a sharp, stylish bob. She wore a tailored coat. She looked healthy, rested, and strong. I did it, Dad, she said softly. The restaurant opened last week. We called it The Bennett. It's already fully booked for the next 2 months. Marco is making the best lasagna in the city. And the staff, they're happy. They smile for real. She adjusted the flowers. And the rest of the money. I did what we talked about. The David Bennett Legal Defense Fund is up and running. We're already helping 3 other families who were crushed by guys like Coleman. We got a guy out of prison last week in Ohio. He was in for 10 years for a crime he didn't commit. Sophie stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. I miss you, she said, her voice catching in her throat. I wish you could see it. I wish you could eat at the restaurant. But I know you're watching. She turned to leave. As she walked down the path, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marco. Table 4 is asking for the owner. It's the governor. He wants to know if he can get a photo. Sophie smiled. She typed back. Tell him the owner is busy. Treat him like everyone else. Everyone gets the same service at the Bennett. She put the phone in her pocket. As she reached the cemetery gates, a black town car was waiting for her. Not because she was a pretentious millionaire, but because she had a meeting with the Innocence Project board across town. Sophie Bennett had entered the world of the elite as a ghost, an invisible waitress meant to be used and discarded. She had left it as a legend. She looked back one last time at the city skyline in the distance. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, Richard Coleman was sitting in a 6x8 cell, eating a cold bologna sandwich on a metal tray. And somewhere in the West Village, people were laughing and eating warm pasta in a room filled with light. Karma hadn't just been served. It had been plated, garnished, and delivered with a smile. Sophie stepped into the car. "Where to, Miss Bennet?" the driver asked. "Forward," Sophie said. "Just drive forward." And that is the incredible, true-to-life story of how Sophie Bennet took down an empire with a pitcher of water and a lot of courage. It reminds us that no matter how powerful someone appears, they are never above the truth. Richard Coleman thought his money could buy silence, but he forgot the most important rule of the service industry. The staff sees everything. Sophie didn't just get revenge, she got justice. She used her windfall to break the cycle of abuse and build a legacy her father would be proud of. It's a powerful lesson that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. What would you have done with the $45 million? Would you have opened a restaurant like Sophie, or bought that private island? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.